Namaste.
Namaste.
So, saints, it's All Saints Day, and yesterday used to be called All Hallows Eve, which is where Halloween comes from. And tomorrow is All Souls Day, because back in the day, they decided that the rest of us schmucks needed a day too.
Especially to get prayed out of purgatory.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And the problem with saints was illustrated for me very well in a conversation I overheard. I think it was last week, and I was at work in the break room, and this woman was talking about this guy, and that works there, and he's a pretty boy. He is. He spends a lot of time in the gym. He has the long blonde hair that he fixes 3 or 4 times a shift to get the ponytail just right. She said that she had, on several occasions, sat next to him, and I knew who she was talking about because she said, he's just so pretty. Well, that'd be him, right? But she said she sits next to him sometimes, and apparently in his cube, he burps with gusto.
Oh, jeez.
And she said it was like not just burping, but relishing it. And she said that for her, she was telling this other person that for her this was a complete turnoff, and it was such a shame because he was so pretty. And that sort of mirrors what we expect from saints. We expect them to be perfect.
They can't belch.
They can't, yeah, but never ever burp. What's that?
It's better that.
Yes, well, or much less pass gas. And in truth, that's unrealistic. I mean, now, maybe, I'm sure if this guy was aware that he could be heard, he must think that the sound dampening walls are soundproofing walls. I'm sure if he could be heard, he'd be horrified. Knew he could be heard, he would be horrified. And maybe what somebody needs to do is just ask him if he got any on him that time. And it would click for him that he was being heard.
Making chili.
Right, that's right. But we have this thing where we look at people who have been recognized as saints, and then we hear that maybe they weren't quite perfect, and now we're shattered. Or people who probably should be saints, recognized as saints, but a lot of people think Dorothy Day should be a saint. She founded the Catholic worker movement, did a lot of really good work, but at some point in her life she had an abortion, so she'll probably never be canonized.
Oh, definitely not.
They'll probably never canonize Thomas Merton because he fell in love with a woman while he was a monk. And the Franciscans wouldn't even take him because he fathered a child out of wedlock prior to entering the monastery. And so what happens is we create this gulf between ourselves and who we think saints are. And yet, I'd be willing to bet that each of us could point to probably at least a couple people in our own lives who've been saints for us, who have been examples, who've been there when we needed them to be there, who were in some way selfless. And since we know them, we probably also know that they burp on occasion, or something.
Never.
Never. And so we think of them as being somehow second order, you know. And I think it's really helpful. That first reading was really helpful because it talks about Buddhism not having sort of an official body that approves saints, and yet they recognize that there have been saints in their traditions. They don't need somebody to say, but put this seal of approval on, you know, to the golden boss, the little pretty thing. And I think we need to move towards that, and maybe we're moving towards that because it was really interesting that when Pope Francis was here, and there's some controversy over, and I cannot even say his name right, Junipera, yeah, that too.
Of course, she knows,
Yeah,
because she's the same.
because she knows how to say too. But what the Pope said was something really interesting. He said that saints aren't perfect, they're human. And I used to get into a lot of arguments at my first church because they would want to, one of their favorite idols was actually inclusive language. And so you could take a writing from 300 years ago, or even 100 years ago, when there was no such thing as inclusive language. They would want to quote somebody in the service, leave the quotation marks around it, but then go in and change all the language so it was gender neutral.
Oh,
And I argued with them that you couldn't have that both ways. You either had to keep the words of the person or drop the quotation marks. And they would even do it to poetry, which just
what?
blows poetry apart, you know.
So much for copyright.
Yeah, oh yeah, well, the music was all castrated for our protection. And, and so, you know, you destroy the person's work because they were a person of their time, which what else could they be? It'd be one thing if you wanted to criticize somebody writing in 2015 for being less than gender sensitive. But if you're talking about somebody writing in 1915, it really isn't fair. But we do that all the time. And maybe it would be really helpful to look at saints as people who were really good at one thing. I mean, they were probably more or less good at other things, kind of sort of good at some other things, almost really good at a couple others, but there was something in them that really shone and allowed them to do things that were exceptional. And then if we backtrack and look at the fact that at St. Paul's time, everybody was in the church was referred to as the saints. Maybe we could stop using this whole notion of saints as a way to put ourselves down. You know, it's one thing to lift somebody up. It's another thing to lift them up and put ourselves down in the process. It's one thing to say, Aaron Rodgers is a really good quarterback. It's another thing to say, Aaron Rodgers is a really good quarterback and I'm a schmuck because I can't throw a football. And yet that's what we do.
Which is true.
That is true. Unless you take the Vitra, then you, or which one is it? I used to have a parishioner who said he wanted to take, I think it's the Vitra, because they had the commercials where the guy was throwing a football through a tire in his backyard. And he said he didn't really care about the intended purpose of the medicine, he always just wanted to be able to throw a football through a tire. So we don't need to bash ourselves in the process of saying somebody was really good at something. And then we have this reading from Wisdom, which I included because it's always been problematic for me. It's one of the readings in the Episcopal Church for funerals. And this translation softens it a little bit. But clearly, saints are not the friend of Smokey the Bear, because when the time comes for judgment, they're going to burst forth and run around like fiery sparks among dry straw, which is how we start forest fires, kids.
Yes.
So, but the thing I like about it is this idea that sometimes, maybe quite often, we look at adversity as if it's a punishment. And we, honestly, many of us were taught that in Sunday schools, and
12 years in Catholic school.
yeah, adversity is a punishment. If something goes wrong, you must have done something wrong. Never mind that the whole book of Job exists to disprove that theory. And yet, it's adversity, or things that seem like adversity, that, at least in the world of metallurgy, that's how you purify gold. You put it in a fire, and the impurities come out. It could be that adversity, while not for a moment saying we would run towards it, or it's desirable, or gosh, I'm glad that happened, can also have the effect of leaving us in a better place. Not in that namby-pamby sort of way that people talk about at funerals. You know, one of the 10 things you never say at a funeral. they're in a better place. And you hear that all the time. But rather in this place where what we go through in that adversity also includes a learning. There's something that we acquire in there. Some of you know there was a schism within the UAC 3 years ago now maybe. And one of the things it taught me was that I was way too attached to a certain view of how the church would develop. And the schism was clear evidence that that wasn't the way it was going to develop. And while it was painful and more, in some ways, interesting to watch other people's reaction, in some ways that was, what's the word I'm looking for, wearying as well. I realized that there was this other lesson in it. And I think that's what this Book of Wisdom reading is trying to say. You know, we look at people who die, we think they're being punished. But everybody dies. We look at people who encounter adversity and we think God isn't happy with them. But that's the nature of life. Buddhism would say, you know, suffering happens. Or I think more accurately, unsatisfactoriness happens. And so maybe, and this is a bit of a reach, I'll grant you that, but maybe it's also true that this struggle we have with saints and their imperfection contains within it a lesson for us. And I hope the lesson is that we can give ourselves a break. That maybe we can start to look at All Saints' Day as saying that we are all saints. Some of us a little better at some things than others. You want your accountant to be better at math than you are, unless you're an accountant, you know. That doesn't mean that you're a bad person. And so we can both enjoy and celebrate these great things that people have done, and enjoy and celebrate the ordinariness of our own greatness.